This is our 11th installment now of Anglicans You Didn't Know You Knew. Again, these videos are designed to introduce you to someone you probably know by name or by some other contribution that they've made to American life, American history, who are also members of the Anglican Church. And so if you're an American, the Anglican Church is very much an important part of your historical, cultural, religious heritage, and in the case of today's subject, also your literature heritage. So I encourage you to consider that as an American. Thomas Stearns Eliot, or as we know him best as TS Eliot, is our subject of today's video. T.S. Eliot is born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri. He's an essayist, a poet, publisher, and playwright. Born into a Boston family that has really deep roots in New England. Tom, he has a brother and he has 5 sisters. His mother, they would all gather around their father around the home, and the father would read Charles Dickens novels to them. So introduced to literature early in his life. He studies at Harvard College, which is the undergraduate college of Harvard University. He's there from 1906 to 1909. Where he earns a B.A. in literature, and then he goes on and gets a Master of Arts, an M.A. in English literature the next year. He moves to Paris in 1910, where there he studies philosophy at Sorbonne, which is the University of Paris. In 1911 to 1914, he's back at Harvard, this time studying Indian philosophy and Sanskrit, interestingly. He wins a traveling fellowship to Germany, so he's over to Germany in 1914. 1916, he completes a doctoral dissertation, but he never returns to Harvard to take his oral exam, which is the only thing that actually stood in between him and his Harvard PhD, so he doesn't get that. He marries Vivienne Haigh-wood in 1915. Sadly, this turns out to be a very unhappy marriage. Vivienne suffers from fatigue, insomnia, migraines, colitis, and great mental instability. And so they become, as time goes by, they become quite detached. They separate in 1933. 1938, she's committed to a mental hospital, and she stays there until 1947 when she finally dies. But she dies of heart disease there, so very sad. Ending for her. So backing up, 1927, T.S. Eliot, he converts to Anglicanism during those years, during that decade. He converts to Anglicanism, and in the same year, he takes up British citizenship as well. So quite attracted to England and her church. He becomes a church warden there at St. Stephen's in Gloucester Road. He finds the Anglican churches to be places of peace and quiet, tranquility. He likes that. He likes the interior. He's attracted to the architecture, both inside and out, and of course, Anglican history as well. Regarding poetry, which we know him the best for, he produces really relatively a small number of poems in comparison to others. In 1915, the editor of Poetry magazine, who is Harriet Monroe, she is the founder, that she's advised, it suggested her that she publish the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a poem of Eliot's. The poem's structure is heavily influenced by T.S. Eliot's reading of Dante, quite an extensive Dante scholar himself. He refers to a number of literary works within it, including a Hamlet as well. In October of 1922, he publishes The Wasteland. The Wasteland may be his most well-known, composed during a period of real great difficulty in his life. And sometimes that great anxiety can really get the creative juices flowing. His marriage is failing at this time. Both he and Vivienne are both suffering, unfortunately, from nervous disorders, along with her other disorders that she suffers from. The Wasteland is often read, actually, then as a representation, interestingly, of the disillusionment of the post-World War I generation. However, Eliot says in 1931, he says, when I wrote a poem called The Wasteland, some of the more approving critics said that I had expressed the disillusionment of a generation, which is nonsense. I may have expressed for them their own illusion of being disillusioned, but that did not form any part of my intention. So perhaps it was partly to do with that difficult period with his wife. Here's a quote from The Wasteland. Just a few lines here. I'm not sure if this will give you a good flavor for it or not. It's a lengthy poem. I recommend you read it. It's very amazing. He writes, April is the cruelest month, breeding, lilacs out of the dead land mixing, memory and desire stirring, dull roots with spring rain. He writes The Hollow Man in 1925. He writes Ash Wednesday in, this is his first long poem. He writes that after his 1927 conversion to Anglicanism. And Ash Wednesday, perhaps influenced, of course, by the Anglican church calendar, Ash Wednesday being a holy day on the calendar. Publishes that in 1930. Sometimes it's referred to as Eliot's conversion poem, in fact. In it, he pulls a lot of quotes from Scripture, which are included in the Book of Common Prayer. So you can see sort of a dual influence here. You'll see lines in it like, Lord, I'm not worthy. We'll say, Lord, I'm not worthy that thou shouldst come under my roof. Or, and the light shone in darkness. Or, O my people, what have I done unto thee? Or also, and let my cry come unto thee. So those are things we're all familiar with as Anglicans, because these are scripture quotes, of course, but incorporated into our words of worship as well. His style of writing in Ash Wednesday shows really a shift in his poetic writing that prior to the conversion in 1927. His post-conversion style continues, in fact, in a similar vein with later poems he would write. In 1939, he publishes a book called The Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. And the Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, well, Old Possum, first of all, is a nickname given to T.S. Eliot by his friend Ezra Pound, who was the editor of Poetry magazine at the time. In 1935, he writes the poem Murder in the Cathedral. And of course, that one's based on the murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, way back in 12th century. In 1954, composer Alan Rawsthorne sets 6 of the poems for speaker and orchestra in a work that he titled Practical Cats. And after Eliot's death, the book was the basis of the musical Cats, which is done by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Is probably what we would. That's the connection we would have most with him. He writes the 4 quartets in 1943, and he actually regards the 4 quartets probably his masterpiece of anything that he's written. It is the work that is really the most of all that led him to win the most awards as well. He gets the Nobel Prize of Literature in 1948 there. He receives actually more awards than almost any other writer in the past 2 centuries, believe it or not, including the Nobel Prize. He also won the Dante Gold Medal, the Goethe Prize, the U.S. Medal of Freedom, and also the British Order of Merit as well. Eliot dies of emphysema in his home in Kensington in London in 1965, January 4th, 1965 he dies. So though not an Anglican by birth, he certainly finds a home in the Anglican Church and lets the literature of the Book of Common Prayer, as well as the Holy Scripture, and its architecture, and he lets all these things really influence his writing and his whole outlook on life. His poetry is very deep, and some would say soul-searching, and of course quite influential. It's known and even been awarded as classic literature, and of course on a pop level once again. Later becomes one of his poems becomes the basis of the long-running play Cats. So T.S. Eliot, someone many of us know by name certainly, and have been exposed to, and yet he continues to remain an Anglican you didn't know you knew.